A bronze anklet glinted under torchlight. The scent of myrrh failed to mask the iron tang of old blood. Somewhere down the hallway, a boy screamed, short, clipped, then nothing. By morning, his body was never found. This was the fate of Aurelius, born Lucio of Cyrene, a boy of gentle hands, sold into silk and shadows. Today we unveil the brutal, delicate, suffocating life of a Roman concubiness, a tale of beauty bought and broken, of power disguised as affection, of a young man devoured by empire. But before we step deeper into this forgotten corridor of history, if stories like this awaken something in you, a fascination with the darker truths, the untold legacies, the shadows that shaped empires, then I invite you to tap that like button and subscribe for more journeys into the hidden past. And tell me in the comments, where in the world are you joining me from? I'm always amazed by how these long-buried tales are being rediscovered by curious minds across the globe, all of us connected by a hunger to understand the world not just as it was told, but as it truly was. The boy's village stood near Cyrene's crumbling Acropolis, wind-worn ruins left by Greeks, repurposed by Romans, forgotten by both. His father was a stonemason, one of many Libyan Greek men who carved the empire's legacy but would never see its heart. His mother sang to the gods of grain and hearth. But no god answered when the slave traders came. Lucio was 12. Puberty had just begun to trace his jaw with shadow. That made him valuable. In the Roman sex economy, beauty was a commodity and boyhood a countdown. The concubiness had to be soft enough to appear untouched by time, but old enough to be pliable, trained. It was a narrow, brutal window. They fed him goat's milk, honey, figs soaked in wine. He was washed twice a day in rose water and vinegar to keep his scent clean, yet stimulating. His skin was shaved, buffed with pumice stones, then oiled. The traders preferred him pale, so he was kept indoors. Fringe historians have debated whether Lucio was castrated during training. The absence of later fertility records suggests he may have been. Rome had no official eunuch class like the Persians, but demand created its own customs. Scissors, red-hot blades, and opium smoke, some boys bled out. Lucio survived. When he arrived in Rome, he was renamed Aurelius. Slaves were often given names that mocked Roman virtue. Golden One, a cruel joke, given the bruises beneath his tunic. He was sold privately, not in the open slave market, but through a domus that specialized in refined acquisitions. These were shadowy houses, operated under the patronage of senatorial wives or retired generals, depending on the clientele. Roman law forbade elite men from owning brothels, but what law could not touch, silence could. Aurelius was purchased by a freedwoman named Domitia Fadilla, known for her menagerie. Officially, she trained domestic staff. Unofficially, she groomed concubines for the imperial court. Boys, girls, and the ambiguous in between, all drilled in dance, diction, perfume, and submission. Aurelius became her star pupil. He learned to recite Horace with downcast eyes. He practiced silent weeping for dinner performances. He was taught to eat without chewing, to bathe without splashing, and to sleep with a single hand folded over his ribs like a funerary statue. At night, he cried into his linen-stuffed pillow, the scent of cedar and olive oil filling his nose until sleep took him. By 15, his face had become an imperial rumor. One guest, historically confirmed to be the uncle of a young senator named Hadrian, left Domitia's villa declaring, "That boy has the eyes of Eros and the patience of a mule." He was ready. The summons came by wax tablet, unceremoniously pressed into his hand. Domitia's expression never wavered. But later that evening, she wept in her atrium. Her golden goose was leaving the nest, for a palace of peacocks, jackals, and gods made of rotting meat. The emperor at that time, identified by most scholars as Tiberius, though others argue it may have been Caligula's early court, was infamous for his piscini, private swimming pools where naked boys performed aquatic dances. Whether Aurelius was taken to Capri or to the Palatine Hill remains contested. What is certain is this: he never saw daylight as a free creature again. His journey into the imperial heart began not with a procession, but in the belly of a litter, behind thick curtains that smelled of sweat and myrrh. He was ordered not to look out. Outside, Rome was a marketplace of agony, beggars, amputees, priests arguing about omens. Inside, silence. The world of whispered flesh awaited. They shaved his head and painted his eyelids with crushed beetles. They threaded gold wire into his ears. His robes were dyed imperial purple, not the real Tyrian kind, but a watered-down version used for ornamental slaves. Still, the visual effect was startling. By 17, Aurelius had mastered the art of invisibility. He moved through the emperor's private quarters like a shadow cast by incense smoke, always near, never seen, always touched, never remembered in official records. He lived in a chamber with no windows, but the walls were lined with mirrors. His body, reflected 100-fold, was his only reality. He was spoken to like furniture. Come closer. Hold that tray. Lie down. He complied. Always. Until one day he laughed, just once, a dry breath through his nose, at a joke made by a visiting consul. The emperor noticed. That laugh changed his life. The next morning, Aurelius was summoned to the imperial bath alone. The guards didn't follow. The water steamed with pine resin. In the mist, a hand reached out, older, trembling, covered in lesions. The emperor's touch was both a reward and a sentence. From that moment, Aurelius was no longer just a pleasure boy. He was the favorite. Historians still debate what that meant. Some suggest he became a confidant. Others argue he was merely a flesh puppet in expensive drapery. One fringe theory even claims he served as a secret courier. His body inked with messages only revealed under heat. There is no hard evidence. But his life changed. The food improved. So did the bedding. He now slept in a chamber of cedar and imported silk. But comfort in Rome was often just a velvet noose. He was watched constantly. He could no longer speak freely to other slaves. His letters were intercepted, though he had no one to write to. And once a week, he was paraded in front of visiting dignitaries, like a curious pet that could quote Ovid and cry on command. One visiting Greek philosopher remarked, "He is like Narcissus made flesh, but with the eyes of someone who has seen his own death too many times." The irony? Aurelius was still technically a slave. No manumission, no citizenship, no lineage. If the emperor tired of him, he would disappear. No tomb, no legacy. Just a shallow grave and a footnote. He grew thinner. His stomach ached. Modern scholars suspect chronic ulcers, likely from wine on an empty stomach and stress-induced purging. Palace physicians prescribed powdered oyster shell, boiled eel, and the sweat of gladiators. None of it worked. At night, he would lie awake, tracing the shape of his ribs, imagining they were the steps of a temple, and he was rising slowly to something divine. He was wrong. The curtain parted with a whisper. Silken threads, purple-dyed and gold-laced, brushed against his cheek as Aurelius entered the cubiculum, the emperor's private chamber. It was warm inside, not from fire, but from the press of too many bodies, all silent, all watching. The emperor lay reclined on a marble chaise, his eyes red-rimmed, half-lidded, and wet with unspent tears. He beckoned with a single, lazy finger. Aurelius moved forward, barefoot, careful not to disturb the tiger pelt rug beneath him. Thus began his life as the emperor's pet. It was not a title. It was not even a role. It was a condition, one between affection and possession, between lover and livestock. And in the Roman imperial court, where paranoia brewed like spoiled wine and trust was as rare as mercy, it was a death sentence with a delay. At first, there was comfort. The emperor, old and riddled with lesions on his inner thighs, treated Aurelius not with cruelty, but with an eerie, childlike dependence. He called him Pupulus, little doll, and ordered musicians to compose lullabies in his honor. One such song survives in fragments on a wax tablet found near Lake Nemi. Soft-footed shadow / golden-hipped dove / touch me not with pity, but silence. Aurelius was forced to sleep at the emperor's feet like a lapdog. If the emperor stirred in the night, he was to stroke his hand. If the emperor wept, and he often did, Aurelius wiped his tears with muslin cloth soaked in rosewater. There were rules. Aurelius was not allowed to ask questions. He could not turn his back on the emperor. He could not eat figs without permission. Every violation earned a silent punishment. No food, no touch, no voice. He quickly learned how to read moods. The emperor's rage had no decibel. It often came cloaked in quiet. A slow blink, a too gentle sigh. When those signs came, Aurelius would prepare himself. A forced kneel in the corner for hours, arms outstretched with amphory balanced in each palm, or worse, ignored for days, locked alone with a wine jug and a chamber pot. And yet he rose. He was moved from the slave quarters to a suite just below the emperor's bedchamber. He received personal guards, ostensibly for protection, though they reported his every move. He dined on peacock tongues, imported oysters from Britannia, and goat brains soaked in saffron and milk. One surviving account from Suetonius mentions a young male attendant who was so finely fed, his flesh was said to smell of cinnamon. Many believe that was Aurelius. At public banquets, he was sometimes paraded, painted in gold dust, wearing only a collar of emeralds. Senators laughed politely. A few averted their eyes. Others, particularly those with similar tastes, lingered in their gaze. He was no longer invisible. He was art, a living fresco, and like any painting, he was hung for display, not respected. But he also listened. As a silent presence in the emperor's inner circle, Aurelius heard everything. The rivalries between the emperor's nephews, the growing tensions with the Praetorian Guard, and most importantly, the rumors of revolt. One cousin, Germanicus' son, perhaps, was gaining popular support among the legions. The emperor, once adored, now spoke in whispers to shadows, accusing his own reflection of betrayal. Aurelius became his confessor, not by choice but necessity. In the hours before dawn, when the emperor's hallucinations were at their worst, he would clutch Aurelius by the wrist and mutter secrets. "They whisper through the statues," he said once. "Even the Sphinx nods when I speak too freely." Another time, "If I die, the worms will feast on my name before my flesh." He wasn't wrong. One evening, during Saturnalia, the emperor hosted a private masquerade. A grotesque affair, half bacchanal, half execution. A prisoner dressed as Saturn was sacrificed with a blunt blade, and guests applauded as he bled out, groaning through his golden mask. Then the emperor turned to Aurelius, handed him a goblet of wine laced with powdered opium, and whispered, "You are too beautiful to last." That night, Aurelius vomited until his throat bled. It wasn't poison, just fear. Court physicians noticed his pallor. They prescribed crushed pearls and crocodile dung, a common treatment for fatigue. The dung, they believed, carried the animal's solar heat and would drive out melancholy. Aurelius complied, swallowing the concoction with honey. Still, he withered. He was no longer a boy, and that in Rome was dangerous. A concubinus was a reflection of youth, and youth expired quickly. His cheeks sharpened, his voice thickened, and a shadow of hair began to trace his jaw. The emperor grew colder. The gifts slowed. The guards became more watchful than protective. One morning, he entered the chamber to find another boy seated at the emperor's side. Younger, wider eyes, a touch clumsier, still untrained. The emperor did not introduce him. He merely said, "Fetch us grapes, Aurelius." He did. He also bled that night, from the nose, from the gums. A sign of internal rupture. Whether from ulcers or something worse, perhaps the infamous lead in the wine vessels. Historians still argue. What is agreed upon is this: his body was beginning to collapse. Yet even as he faded, he learned to wield what little power he had left. He began to whisper, too, to the chamberlain, to the eunuch who dressed the new favorite, to a Greek astrologer who served as the emperor's dream interpreter. Aurelius, still in his silks, began to plant seeds. Not threats, not lies, just curiosities. He says the emperor only fears shadows, not people. Did you hear about the plot? No. Oh, perhaps I dreamed it. They listened. They always listened. In a palace built on paranoia, every whisper had weight. He played a dangerous game, but he had little choice. He was no longer just an object. He was an omen, and Rome loved omens. A Senate slave, whose records place him as Aurelius's food taster for 3 months, later wrote in a secret letter, he carried death in his smile. We feared him more than the emperor. Another source, likely forged but too compelling to dismiss, describes a dinner where Aurelius laughed too loudly and the emperor flinched, ordering that all mirrors be removed from the chamber, lest his reflection betray him. The mirrors never returned, but Aurelius remained. For now, his flesh, once perfumed and prized, now carried the scent of decay. Beneath his arms, sores festered. His breath stank of blood and vinegar, and yet he still wore the emerald collar. still smiled, still listened, still waited. Because in Rome, a fallen favorite didn't just disappear. He became a legend or a warning. The ceiling of the emperor's bedchamber was painted with gods. Apollo drove his chariot through dawn. Diana knocked an arrow in perpetual silence. But the real gods of this place whispered beneath the marble, thin voices, cloaked in silk and rumor, feeding a city's paranoia one breath at a time. Aurelius no longer belonged to the emperor. He belonged to the palace. It began with a single question. A chamberlain, pausing beside him in the corridor, murmured, "Do you still sleep in the imperial chamber?" It was not asked with cruelty. It was bait, a test. Aurelius answered only with a smile. That was enough. Within days, more questions followed. Had the emperor spoken of his will? Did he ever mention the African provinces? Did he still take wine at night, or laudanum? Aurelius answered none. But his silence said everything. He had become what no concubine should ever be. Interesting. The court, built on architecture and duplicity, had started to turn inward. The emperor's health waned. He no longer attended public games. His hands trembled visibly when signing decrees. One of his nephews, rumored to be planning a coup, began sending scented letters to senators in Hispania. The Praetorian Guard stood tighter around the palace gates, but looser in discipline. Everyone expected death. They just didn't know from whom. Aurelius, caught in the eye of this storm, walked the marbled halls like a ghost given too much scent. He was offered bribes, small at first, a brooch, a rare plum, a kiss on the shoulder from a noblewoman's son. Then larger, scrolls with forged names, promises of escape to Alexandria, even an amphora of liquid gold. He took nothing. That too was bait. To accept meant complicity. To decline meant suspicion. So he did what all survivors did in the late empire. He let others think he had already chosen sides. Aurelius was no fool. He knew history did not favor men like him. Slaves who became too visible were usually torn apart by dogs or drowned in public fountains. Even imperial favorites, once discarded, were rarely allowed to age. The Roman court, especially under emperors addicted to omens, could not abide ghosts. And Aurelius, gaunt, silent, impossible to read, had become precisely that. Historians agree that this is the period when Aurelius likely began keeping records. Not letters, those could be intercepted. Not scrolls, too easily burned. But memory maps, geometric patterns sewn into his tunic hem, or hummed tunes encoded with dates and names. It's a theory supported by the discovery of a textile fragment found near the Palatine Hill, bearing an elaborate spiral pattern in purple thread, traced with hidden symbols beneath. Modern textile forensics suggest it was stitched with human hair. His own, perhaps. A way to record history when parchment could not be trusted. And history surrounded him. The emperor began speaking in riddles. He claimed the statues in the atrium were melting at night. He ordered the public fountains drained, fearing assassins in the water pipes. One morning, he demanded every fish in the palace be inspected for messages. Aurelius was summoned to perform for him again, naked but for a fox mask, reciting a poem about metamorphosis. When he stumbled on a line, the emperor threw a goblet at him. It missed. He was told not to eat that night. The next day, a senator was arrested for treason. 2 nights later, another boy, the emperor's new favorite, was found dead in the baths. Slipped. Drowned. Or so they said. Aurelius had been seen speaking to him earlier that day. A handful of figs, a whisper. A glance. The palace began to turn cold toward him. One of the kitchen slaves refused to make his tea. A laundress spat in his tunic water. A guard whispered, "Dead boys don't get tombs." But one figure stood apart, Julia Balbina, a freedwoman and astrologer, feared for her uncanny accuracy. She had once predicted the exact hour of a general's execution simply by measuring the slant of a shadow during a storm. She took an interest in Aurelius, not as a threat, but as a puzzle. She summoned him one afternoon, under the pretense of reading his natal chart. "You were born on a day when Venus drowned," she said, pouring wine into a bowl and watching how the oil floated. "That makes you a mirror. You don't reflect people, you reflect what they want to see. That is why they'll kill you." Aurelius said nothing. She leaned closer. "I can keep you alive, but you'll be alone forever." He smiled. I already am. That conversation marked a shift. Aurelius began avoiding the emperor's chamber. He claimed illness, then visions, then fasting. He was no longer summoned for pleasure. The emperor's mind had decayed too far to remember desire. And so the boy who once slept curled at his feet now slept beneath a cracked fresco of Mercury alone. The corridors began to narrow. The whispers turned to accusations. One morning, he was seized without warning, dragged not to prison, but to the augurium, a chamber used by augurs to interpret omens from bird entrails. There, in full view of senators and court astrologers, he was stripped to the waist and presented beside a rotting pigeon. The augur claimed the gods had sent warnings, and that Aurelius carried the decay of empire in his breath. They measured his heartbeat. They burned strands of his hair. They asked him if he had dreamt of wolves. He had. He said nothing. The emperor did not intervene. From that moment, Aurelius knew he was already dead. He tried to escape. Once, a steward's cloak, a forged seal, a bribe to a chariot driver bound for Tiber. But the gates had changed since the last time he was truly free, and the guards had orders now. When they caught him, they didn't beat him. They didn't even speak. They simply returned him to the palace, to a lower chamber beneath the old kitchens, a forgotten place that stank of spoiled grain and ancient grease. He lived there for 3 weeks. No light, no mirrors, only the slow echo of dripping wine from a cracked amphora. And rats. He spoke to them. They listened. Then one day, he was brought up again, washed, perfumed, shaved, and returned to his former chamber. No explanation, only silence, and the sound of the emperor laughing softly, somewhere behind the walls. Aurelius stood before the mirrorless wall. He touched the emerald collar still around his throat. It was tarnished now. The green had dulled to something more like swamp water. He did not cry. He simply whispered, "I am still here." And the palace, somehow, seemed to shudder in response. They came for him in the night. Not with spears, not with shouts, but with sandals whispering on marble and oil lamps flickering like dying stars. 3 figures in hooded cloaks. No insignia, no words, just a scroll pressed flat to his chest. Aurelius didn't need to read it. He already knew. He was not to be executed, not formally. That would have required charges, paperwork, and witnesses. Instead, he was to be removed. Unwritten. The fate reserved for men who had seen too much and belonged to no one. The empire had no room for inconvenient ghosts. And so began his fall beneath the feathers. They took him not to the dungeons, nor the execution pit, but to the Conatio Rotunda, the emperor's grand rotating banquet hall, abandoned for repairs after a seismic crack split the ceiling. Dust hung in the air like moths. Birds nested in the rafters. There, beneath a peeling fresco of Ganymede held aloft by Jupiter's eagle, a couch had been laid with red cushions. A single jug of wine waited beside it. The emperor was not present. Only Macro, the Praetorian prefect, stood nearby. A man of ambition shaped like stone. His face was unreadable. "You were loved," he said flatly. "That makes you dangerous." Aurelius said nothing. His hands were shaking, but not from fear, from hunger. He had not eaten in 2 days. Macro sighed as though bored. "We are giving you dignity. Others don't get that." 2 guards stepped forward. One held a length of purple fabric, soft, ceremonial, choking. The other bore a dagger, curved like a question mark. But Aurelius raised a hand. "No, let me do it." This surprised them. So did what followed. He took the dagger with fingers still streaked with dust. He walked toward the peacock-feathered cushion, the place where so many had dined and died. And there, with slow, unhurried movements, he began to undress. Not out of shame, out of ritual. He had once been dressed by slaves for the emperor's pleasure. Now he disrobed himself in front of death. One layer at a time, peeling back the lie Rome had clothed him in. First the robe, then the tunic, then the emerald collar. It fell with a soft clink. He lay down on the cushion. The dagger trembled in his hand. But he didn't use it, because in that moment, someone else entered the hall. Julia Balbina, the astrologer, uninvited, her shawl fluttering like wings. She held a scroll in one hand and a cage in the other. Inside, a dove, painted red with cinnabar. She tossed the scroll at Macro's feet. "Divine command," she said. Macro opened it, frowned. A dream order? Yes, she lied. The Emperor's last. There was no signature, no seal. But that didn't matter. Fear had always outranked fact in the imperial court. Macro hesitated. He glanced at Aurelius, then at the guards. Let him go, he ordered. The guards obeyed, not out of loyalty, but because they too had seen omens in dreams. And Balbina was never wrong. Aurelius did not weep. He simply stood, took the dagger, pressed it to his lips, then handed it back. He was escorted, not to the slave pens, but to a litter waiting outside the back wall of the palace, shrouded in muslin, driven by a faceless freedman. No words were spoken, and then he vanished. For weeks, the court buzzed. Had he died? Had he fled? Some whispered he'd been sold to Parthian diplomats. Others claimed he'd joined a mystery cult in Ostia, masking his face with ash and salt. A fringe belief held that Balbina had him hidden beneath the Temple of Saturn, where he slept in a stone alcove surrounded by crows. The Emperor never asked. He died 3 months later, choking on his own tongue, if the sources are to be believed. Others say poison. Others still say Aurelius returned in secret, slipping something into his fig compote. All that survives is silence. But a curious piece of evidence emerged generations later. In a sewer tunnel beneath the Aventine Hill, workmen repairing a collapsed vault discovered a fresco. Faded, cracked, partially buried. It showed a young man reclining on a feathered cushion, naked, one hand lifted toward a dove in flight. His face was hauntingly detailed, eyes wide, mouth slightly parted, a single tear painted beneath his left eye. And beneath it, etched in crude Latin. He listened. He waited. He flew. The fresco was never displayed publicly. Officials deemed it improper. But scholars copied it, debated it. Some believe it was painted by Aurelius himself, in hiding. Others say it was the work of a freedman who loved him. Others dismiss it entirely. But the image persists. And so does the story. In back alleys of Trastevere, beggars still speak of the feathered boy. In early Christian writings, a heretic sect worshipped a golden youth who suffered for imperial sin. And in one late imperial satire, a character clearly modeled on Aurelius appears as a ghost in a mirror, warning a corrupt senator. Do not teach the statues to watch. Even erased, Aurelius refused to vanish. He had become what Rome feared most. A slave who remembered. A lover who survived. A body that left behind a soul. Time did not preserve Aurelius. Not directly. No bronze statue in the Forum bore his likeness. No inscription named him among the household slaves of the Domus Augustana. His name was never recited in temples, never painted on amphorae, never woven into the genealogies of patrician houses. But his shadow lingered, stubborn, quiet, and inconvenient, wrought behind the veil. In the years after the emperor's death, the palace changed. New walls were erected, rooms renamed. The Conatio Rotunda was sealed permanently, blamed for structural instability, though whispers suggested it was haunted by a boy who bled peacock feathers. Servants refused to clean certain chambers after dark. The scent of rosewater reportedly returned in gusts, unexplained and sour. Mirrors in the eastern wing were found cracked without impact. One Praetorian claimed he saw his own reflection wink at him before he lost his mind and leapt into the Tiber. Aurelius had become a palace rumor, and rumors in Rome could outlive gods. Fragments of his life remained in odd places. A physician's notebook from the era contains a recipe labeled for hollow-chested youth, favored by royalty. The ingredients include honey, ashes of snail shell, and a drop of menstrual blood, an ancient charm against feverish wasting. A fringe theory suggests the formula was concocted specifically for Aurelius, whose condition, ulcers or consumption, was never diagnosed. In the home of an exiled senator's daughter, a private collection of obscene wall art was discovered 2 centuries later. Among them, a fresco of a boy kneeling before a veiled figure, a green collar around his neck, his mouth open as if in mid-song. The historian who catalogued it described the figure as uncannily elegant, his posture suggesting training rather than devotion. The fresco was removed and painted over during a later restoration, but a sketch survives. Still, no trace of his body was ever found. No grave, no urn, no burial record. He had been unpersoned. Yet in the writings of Lucius Valerius Celsus, a satirist from the mid-1st century, there exists a curious tale, a nameless concubine who survives a paranoid emperor and lives among prostitutes near the Subura district, where he becomes a fortune-teller for the disfigured and damned. In one line, the character tells a blind soldier, "They dressed me in purple. Now I dream only in black." Scholars still debate whether the satire reflects a real person. But those who study the undercurrents of Roman trauma, slavery, sexual power, imperial madness, see in it echoes of something darker, truer. It is also known that in a now-lost manuscript from the Temple of Isis at Beneventum, a prayer ends with the line, "To the boy of broken mirrors, carry our words into the rooms where names are unwelcome." No other explanation is offered. In modern times, Aurelius's story is sometimes resurrected in opera and literature. One 19th century composer, enthralled by the idea of a voiceless boy who controlled an emperor through silence, wrote a libretto titled L'Usignolo d'Ombra, the Shadow Nightingale. In it, the character of Aurelius never speaks, but his presence changes the course of every scene. Aurelius the voiceless, Aurelius the erased, Aurelius the survivor. Historians still argue over his legacy. Was he victim or manipulator? A mirror or a flame? A willing participant in imperial debauchery, or a child sacrificed to the appetites of a dying god? The truth lies somewhere in between, as it often does with Rome. What we know for certain is this: within the great machinery of empire, its columns and colonnades, its orgies and oracles, its conquests and decadence, there existed countless lives like Aurelius's. Lives not of generals or emperors, but of those crushed beneath sandals, stitched into shadows, and buried behind veils. But Aurelius did not vanish. He haunted, he waited, and through fragments, whispers, and dreams he returned. Because Rome never truly buried its sins. It embalmed them in rumor, and sometimes in mirrors. So let us now lower the torchlight. Let the marble corridors of that ancient palace fall silent again, the scent of wine and dust settling like ash upon memory. The story of Aurelius ends not with triumph or tombstone, but with silence, and that silence, strangely, speaks more powerfully than any monument. He was never meant to be remembered, and yet here we are, sifting through ruins and riddles, chasing the shape of a boy who refused to vanish. Perhaps that's why stories like this matter. They are not about heroes or villains, not about battles or borders. They are about the delicate lives swallowed by empire, by power, by hunger dressed in velvet. They are about the costs of being beautiful in a world that devours beauty, the risks of tenderness in a court that weaponized affection, and the quiet horror of being remembered only as a shadow. But there is dignity in remembering. And in telling his story, even with the gaps, the guesses, the ghostly echoes, we defy the very machine that tried to erase him. So wherever you are, whoever you are, remember this. Even the smallest voice, if carried through time with care, can still echo through marble halls. Even a concubine, crushed in the folds of history, can rise again, if only as a whisper. And as always, if stories like this awaken something in you, a fascination with the darker truths, the untold legacies, the shadows that shaped empires, then I invite you to tap that like button and subscribe for more journeys into the hidden past. And tell me in the comments, where in the world are you joining me from? I'm always amazed by how these long-buried tales are being rediscovered by curious minds across the globe, all of us connected by a hunger to understand the world not just as it was told, but as it truly was.